Okay, time to go to the Mun and back. If you were with us for the first episode, you know we managed to get a craft up into orbit around Kerbal. Now we're going to try and go a little bit further. We're going to need a bigger rocket, but we're going to try and get ourselves a ship that can get up to the Mun, maybe do an orbit around it, get some science, come back, and then maybe we'll have a look and if we can do that. We'll see if we can try and get a ship to land on there. So we're going to need a little bit more power to get us up there, mainly because we're going to be needing to actually blast out from Kerbin's orbit and get ourselves up to the Mun and actually get in orbit of it and then return. So you need a little bit more fuel. Still, the tech we're using at the moment is a little bit more primitive than I would like to have used, but I'm sure there are many people out there who could possibly do a few less boosters than I do on this one. But off we go, and this is the first rocket we decided to test it with, and the first stages dropped off quite nicely, continued moving on upwards, and then we started to encounter some problems, and I don't know whether it's because of the fins that I had on there or whether it was the lack of any sort of decent SAS modules, because we haven't unlocked that in the science yet, but we began to spin, and the spin got quite out of control. I couldn't bring it back under control. Bearing in mind the only sort of SAS or control we have on this is the tiny little bit of torque that's available in the top command module at the moment, because the SAS modules themselves haven't been unlocked. And as you can see, I was trying to keep pushing myself upwards and upwards by just blasting off a bit of the thrust as we were pointing upwards, but it just wasn't enough to fight against gravity. We managed to get ourselves into an awkward orbit around Kerbin, and just enough fuel then just to drop ourselves back down again into it. And to be honest, the first flight up, it really just terrible failure. So we still managed to make sure we grabbed a couple of bits of science from landing, picked that all up. Obviously, if we got a little bit more science, if some science is better than none, and with the science that we were able to pick up from that enabled us to go into the science tree and just unlock a bit more, including some better fins and the first of the SAS modules. So I lobbed some SAS modules onto these rocket boosters just to hopefully stabilize it a bit more going up, and also put some extra fins, improved fins, onto the side of the ship, and we'd have a second attempt at getting up there. So with the second launch, the hope was to do it without spinning, and we spun again. So, however, it was only a very quick spin, and most of the propulsion we needed to get ourselves up into a decent distance to be able to actually start doing our orbiting maneuver actually worked, and we were able to push up into a full orbit around Kerbin, which was exactly what we were looking for. And then it was just a case of then just setting ourselves a nice course off to the Mun. So even with the spin on the second one, we actually managed to get somewhere. Now, here's something I learn't from watching Shadow Zone's YouTube videos about when you're plotting your course to the Mun, try and get it so that your periapse with the Mun is as close, or anybody that anything that you're trying to actually enter into orbit to is as close as you can without, obviously, if it's got an atmosphere, hitting the atmosphere itself. Because what it does, it curves your trajectory slightly as you go around, which just means you're just going to save a little bit more on fuel. As you can see, there's a nice little curve there around where it's due to hit into the Mun there. Didn't quite get it to where we wanted to there, but if we got it to where we were trying to target there, it would have been a bit better than what we did, but it's still some, which is better than none. And with that sort of kind of curve, it just means you're going to have a little bit of an easier time, more fuel efficient time in trying to establish your orbit around the body. And considering how inefficiently I launch from Kerbin, then yeah, that's probably the best option for us, is if we can try and make everything else in it as fuel efficient as possible. As you can see, we've actually made it to the Mun as well in orbit, and so we're just picking up some extra science and some lovely amounts of science that we can pick up from that as well when we've hit around there. Again, using these tiny little modules in there. One of the things that Kerbal have changed, Kerbal Space Program has changed in the recent editions, is that aerodynamics is taken more into account with its new aerodynamic model, now that it's being rendered up in Unity 5. So things like these little cargo bays that you can store things and tuck things away and everything else are actually quite essential in some senses for your rockets, if you don't want bits hanging off everywhere around the side. And it looks a lot neater. We all like a neat looking ship. But I encountered a problem. You may can spot it here. In fact, actually, you can see that the fins are turning, which happens when you try maneuvering around in space. But the ship itself isn't, even though the SAS in the actual that little command module should still be active. So the ship just wasn't turning at all, wasn't rotating, moving or anything. And that's a problem, because now I got no way to orientate the ship other than with the actual main booster itself. You can do it with the main booster, and I thought, well, let's give it an attempt. We had tried a few things there. I checked the torque and everything else, and it just wasn't doing it. So I thought, right, well, let's just try it on the main booster itself and see if that will get us back to Kerbin. We can get a trajectory back. We even try flicking in and out of the space center, see if that would actually enable it to maneuver. No, it didn't. So as we got closer to the point where we needed to make the burn to be able to actually move away from the orbit of the Mun, I just used a very tiny bit of thrust off the main engine and just basically maneuvered through the main engine itself. Now you can see my path that I was plotting there. This is one of the best ways to sort of get back to Kerbin there from the Mun, is by basically setting a course which has its periapse back to Kerbin is inside the atmosphere, so that the drag from the atmosphere is just going to catch you and prevent you from actually going any further. But then of course you've got to come down from quite a fast speed into Kerbin itself, and so what I did when we got back to Kerbin was try and burn off as much speed as possible using that engine, even though this is meant to be, normally I would have discarded this at some point a bit higher up and then use the actual top module to come down through the atmosphere, which is where the re-entry shield is. As you see, obviously, without any sort of SAS to actually keep us orientated, because that seems to have broken. And if you know why it's broken, please tell me in the comments below, because I can't figure it out. I've checked everything I could think of, and I couldn't think of why that broke. But obviously, I need to try and keep the ship orientated in the right direction coming through here. So I wanted to try and use the engines for as long as possible to keep us in the right orientation as we came through. But then you start getting to this point where you've got the heat going off, and you're like, do I keep the engine part on, or do I eject that and has it going down without anything actually stabilizing the top part of the ship? And it kind of worked once I had separated, and we, as you can see, we're just starting to go, but then it started to tilt and orientate in a way that wasn't so good. And then we get to this, and yes, that will be the first Kerbal I've lost in space, unfortunately. We did say back at the beginning of the last episode there will probably be Kerbals die, and I'm not doing the F5 quick saves to reload should I muck up at any point in time. So if a Kerbal dies, unfortunately. I see part of the rocket there. Maybe I should have kept the ship as part of it, because that's actually survived through the re-entry. And if it had got me to actually decelerate below the speed where heat was going to have a major effect, I could have then separated it off and come back down normally. So hindsight's a wonderful thing there. But meanwhile, it's time to send up a second rocket to give that another attempt, and hopefully not break so much. This time we've got, because we killed Jeb in the last one, we now have Valentine Kerbin in the piloting it. And she goes back up and does everything that Jeb had just done, gets all the various elements of science that we need for the ship itself. And thankfully this time we actually have a rocket that can actually maneuver and point towards its necessary parts. The SAS didn't break this time, and we were able to bring her back down to Kerbal. More or less, I mean, I would have really normally, I mean, you'll see throughout this this episode, I was leaving it a bit too late to be ejecting my bottom stages. Not the best times to actually be ejecting at this point, but I did then decide to release that off, and again began to spin the ship, and I thought, oh no, here we go, we're going to have an exact repeat of what we did last time. And look at that, the explosion. But wait, nope, just the science module exploded, and the heat shield's flown off. But the rest of it's still coming down relatively intact, which is quite impressive, actually, in some senses. So I was quite pleased that she actually managed to get that through there. Though it still carries on for quite some distance with a little bit of the heat warnings coming up, we actually managed to get it all the way through the atmosphere. And I tell you, once we actually decelerated slow enough to be able to actually lose the heat effects and get into drop the parachutes, I couldn't have been more relieved at that point, because it was like I thought it really was just waiting for it to explode. So that was a great load of new science brought back, and we've now successfully returned a ship back from orbit of the Mun. So the next step was to try and build something that would get us back to the Mun again. but this time with something that would actually land on the Mun. So this is the lander that I started building for it, and part of what I'm calling the Excelsior series, because Excelsior was one of my favourite designs of ships from Star Trek. Some of you might moan about merging parts in too close into the rocket bodies, but I quite like the design of this, where, you know, push, even though the fuel tank's been pushed in, which you shouldn't really do because it's not realistic. Some people will moan about that, but hey, if it looks good, it looks good. But I like the fact that it's a 9 rocket engine on the bottom of there. And it's a bit like SpaceX's Falcon 9 has 9 Merlin engines stuck to the bottom of it. So this the stage there had a number of rockets built into there. Bit of a rocket, but it needs to be. It's transporting something that's going to attempt to land on the Mun. If you're wondering why I put the science module above the command capsule instead of below it or in some other random location, the reason purely for that being in that location was just the consideration of the fact that once I landed on the Mun, I was going to need to get the Kerbal out of the actual spacecraft and back into it. So we brought ourselves up into orbit around Kerbal, and those 9 engines firing off nicely. Actually, I quite like the way that looks. And then we just dropped that off. We got these extra tanks on the side. Notice so far, everything we've done, you know, little stop there just to get rid of the top cap and the boosters. Nothing has been left in orbit. Everything was ejected before we reached orbit, so therefore it's all going to come back down to Kerbal, and there's no random space junk just flying around Kerbal itself. So here we go. We are plotting the next bit of course on the second to last tank that we can use there, moving around in position, and then we just blast out, try and push out back to the Mun like we did before, but this time we're going to enter orbit around the Mun and then try and land on the Mun as well. Not the most prettiest ways of doing it at the moment, as you can see, but we did actually get there and actually get a very close encounter with the Mun as well, which is exactly what we needed in order to be as efficient as we can, and we needed to be as close as possible. So we just burnt off, bring the orbit down, and then there are 2 ways in which you can land on the Mun, from what I understand. There might be more, but there's 2 main ways. There's the safe way, and then there's the suicide way. Now, I know a lot of people will say because suicide burning is the most efficient way, which is literally you just point at a point on the surface and then just burn as just before you hit the surface and burn enough fuel to be able to actually bring yourself to a stop. It's called a suicide burn for a reason. It's because of the amount of times that people end up blowing their ships up while doing it in Kerbal Space Program. The other way, the more efficient way, is the way that I'd prefer to do most of the time, which is this way, which is you bring yourself low over to the points roughly where you want to land. You then burn off all of your orbital speed until you basically come to a stop above a point on the surface, and then you just allow gravity to start bringing you down slowly over the point, and as you come down then you just start burning off again just to slow your full speed down. You can see just accelerating, time accelerating a couple of times there, but it does the trick. Just keep burning off a bit, bringing it down to a nice safe speed, and then just slowly drop the ship down onto the Mun surface there. It can be a little bit tedious compared to a suicide burn because you're constantly watching, just seeing your speed, trying to gauge when to drop it all in. But it gets you down most of the time quite nice and safely. And one of the things I do, I use normally one of the main stage parts to actually act as the sort of the decelerator here. As you can see, the part of the rocket is still stuck underneath it, unlike the Apollo, which just went down probably with what would be the equivalent on this, the top part of the module. But it does mean when I'm getting close to the surface, and either when I've run out of fuel in the tank or just getting close, I can just drop it off like that. And it acts like a bit of like a gauge to let me know how far I got left before I hit the surface. So as you can see, it's just hit not far below me, so I know I haven't got far to go, and I can use that as a bit of a marker as well as the shadows to be able to tell how far I got to go. And with a little bit of a skid, we've made it down onto the surface. So we can grab some more great, fantastic science from the surface of the Mun, which is going to boost up the amount of science we've got if we can get this all back to Kerbal itself. And then we just pop out and do a bit of Mun walking and get a bit more surface samples and jump up and down and go, yay, we've made it. Plant a flag onto the Mun, and yeah. I've noticed this with the latest versions of Kerbal. It's the flags don't like sticking in the ground or staying stuck in the ground. They just keep falling over. So obviously they haven't got as good a manufacturer anymore for their flag poles as they used to have. Then it was a case of just being able to get back onto the craft and then taking off, heading into orbit. You give yourself another push to get yourself high enough and then generate a circular orbit. I wasn't aiming to try and do it in a perfect way, just to get into the orbit and then head back to the back to Kerbal itself. One of the things I like doing about this bend, you notice it actually cuts across its path and brings it a little bit closer off the orbit back to where it is, but you'll see it drop back over and then just time accelerate away towards Kerbal. And yeah, there's another little glitch that you may have spotted there. If you're accelerating too fast while in that screen, that ship should have technically blown up because I accelerated and left it accelerating too long, but it didn't. It just whipped right round as though Kerbal had no effect on him. And possibly a little, well, more than likely a little bug that's still left in there, and Unity's, since they changed it over to the Unity 5 engine, but there's still, obviously there's going to be plenty of patches, I guess, in the future that will correct little things like that. And then it was a case of bringing the ship back down through orbit, back down through the atmosphere. You can see it all burning off there. And the hope was that everything on this craft was going to be protected behind that heat shield at the front. And with that explosion, you can see it didn't. For some reason, those science modules are really susceptible to heat, and it doesn't take much heat to cause them to explode. At least in this version, because it never used to be as much in the older versions, but then atmospheric re-entry has become more and more deadly, I think, as Kerbal's gone through and tried to be more and more realistic. But we were still able to keep the ship straight and bring the rest of the science down, so it's only one science module lost. Okay, it's one of the better science modules, so, but we were able to bring back everything else that was picked up on the Mun, and it's just basically burning through the atmosphere, heading down and heading back to claim all of that as we get back to the land there. I can't remember if it was this one or later on. At some point I realised you can jettison, yeah, it was this one, you can jettison the heat shield, so I tried that, except for I got it wrong and it ended up stuck inside of the ship. So, as you can see, we got a lot more science, and I thought, right, okay, we've done that. Let's try a bit more. Let's try and get a bit more science from the Mun, because we need a lot more science, so let's build another ship. Similar to the last one, so it was based on the same designs, but I wanted to try a couple of different things, and one of the big variations you see there at the very top there is I thought, right, well, as my plan last time didn't work with bringing the heat shield, bringing the whole thing back down behind its heat shield, we'll try it again this time, but behind, we'll try it with a second ship. So we're landing it all as one, because it's a lot taller, but we've got a probe core on the top there as well, and a separator. As you can see, bringing this one down, we actually broke some of the feet. And you might notice Jeb's back, and it's because the main four initial characters will respawn, so I'm saying this is the first clone of Jeb who's flying this version. Obviously not doing as grand a job as the last Jeb did, when in fact actually he's doing exactly the same way and still managing to crash his ship. But yeah, it's going back to it, we were saying with the top parts there, we were planning on basically separating that once we were getting into orbit around the Mun and sending it back separately, so that you had two smaller components coming back through the atmosphere. So we managed to make it down successfully, even though we broke some of the legs, and we managed to get it standing upright again, and I thought, right, I'd take off. But the process of it all, I think I'd burnt too much fuel. This is where I burnt too much fuel. I was trying to correct its actual inclination. I had taken off in the wrong direction. I thought, right, let's get up there and try and see if we can change direction. Bad mistake. Lost all my fuel. Like, all of it. And I still hadn't achieved orbit around the Mun. So, I had a problem. But I thought, okay, well, let's try and see if we can get the probe core, because it's still got fuel in there, and a little bit of fuel in there, and an engine. And then that exploded. So I had lost that bit, and now I've got this command module from the bottom bit just floating around above the Mun, eventually destined to come crashing back down. I was sort of kind of hoping if I pointed it towards the Mun, maybe, just maybe, it might survive. You know, take the brunt of it on the bottom of it, then the command module just roll off or something like that. You know, it can occasionally happen if you, depending on how you crash, and you find parts spinning off and surviving what would have otherwise been completely catastrophic. But in this case, that's actually the death of the second Kerbal we've had, which is in one of Jeb's clones. So with the death of the first clone of Jeb as well as the original Jeb, we thought, right, okay, let's give it another go. This time we'll go back to the person we knew who could do it successfully, and we'll get Valentina back on board and flying it off back to Kerbal. So very quickly, rapidly showing you getting that ship back out to Kerbal as before, bringing it down back to the Mun's surface, and hopefully doing it with a little bit more success than we did last time, learning from our mistakes. And down it comes, and we're just dropping it off there, hopefully without the crash. Actually had to jump up a little bit there just to make sure that we didn't actually have the rocket fly back up from the surface and hit us, and then very slowly bring it down, and success! Actually landed that one properly without breaking the legs. Obviously those legs, I think, were basically stretching it with the amount of weight that we're putting on them. They're not fantastic, they're more intended for small probes than great big landers. You might have noticed that on the last one. One of the problems you get if you put too much items around the door is sometimes it projects you out like that. So it was just a case of, yeah, you did get back and trouble getting back onto it itself. One of the things I did notice though when I was on this version was there was something in orbit, and it was this. That probe from the last rocket actually survived, and when I went back and looked at the video after the explosion, you can actually see it fly off in the corner. So for some reason it had stayed concentrated on the actual decoupler ring that was attached around the engine, preventing the engine from firing, and that was the bit that actually exploded. And that had actually flown off with enough thrust to get it into orbit and then shut its own engine off. So I thought I'd try bringing it back. However, it was the one which was sent up with Jeb, and knowing the success of Jeb so far, we thought maybe we could bring this back. And as I mentioned earlier, I keep losing my rockets until the last minute, and it turned there, and we lost the entire top probe part. Great. So we get a nice pretty fireworks show all coming back down, but I should learn not to try and move the craft off to the side while we're in the middle of an atmospheric re-entry and try and turn its side on to get rid of the rocket booster, but just take the risk if we are at that point. Or better still, I should just learn to eject the booster before we hit the atmosphere. That would make more sense. But yeah, that meant we had lost the second one. So it was time to take the one with Valentina back up. Managed to eject the probe top off quite happily, also eject off the actual main module itself. They all did exactly as we wanted to without any of the loss of the fuel like we did with the Jeb version. Set a course straight back to Kerbal and head back in. And I started to think, right, let's get a little bit cocky with it a bit, and let's try and send both of them back roughly around the same sort of times. Come back down, get rid of the booster. I'd managed to remember to do it this time well in advance of actually hitting the atmosphere, which meant we had a nice smooth entry all the way through the atmosphere, or as smooth as it could be as it going through the atmosphere, and we landed another one back with a load more science. And then all that was left for us to do was to bring the module back that was already on its way back down, and see if we could actually do this one this time without the same problems that we had when we tried to bring the last module down. You can see edging slowly closer towards the atmosphere. Got rid of the booster in plenty of time, and then just as you get towards the atmosphere, then it starts to heat up and you haven't got the booster anymore getting in the way. So the key there is, if you do want to eject your boosters, do it before you hit the atmosphere, not once you've hit the atmosphere, because you never know what's going to happen. Give yourself at least about 10 to 20 kilometers clear before you do hit it, otherwise you could end up blowing your ships up. But as you can see, this one came through quite nice and successful as well. Out come the parachutes, dropping on down, and that'll be another load of science then that we can bring back and use for the future ones. So Mun attack quite successful. Alright, only 2 Kerbals lost, but we managed to get some science back, and I think that puts us in a good stead for next time of being able to go and explore and we'll try and reach Mimbus. Catch you next time.